Welcome back to our conversation with Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And Mr. Rothstein, you talked about remedies. And in your book, you outline a number of them. People lately are hearing a lot about reparations. What does that mean to you? It can't seem to get off first base in Congress.
Well, you're right. We don't have the kind of civil rights movement today that can create the pressure to remedy these policies. We have a lot of protests, which is very productive and creative around Black Lives Matter, but those protests haven't created yet the kind of civil rights movement that's going to go beyond reform of the police, which is essential, the removal of statues and other commemoratives to the defenders of slavery. That movement has to grow to get engaged in the underlying, much more difficult to remedy housing policy. So, for example, we don't need to wait for the federal government to begin to create subsidies for African Americans to move to neighborhoods from which they had been excluded when those neighborhoods were more affordable. The real estate agencies, the banks that collaborated with the federal government in creating the segregation should be creating funds to subsidize the movement of African Americans into higher opportunity neighborhoods where they have better access to jobs and transportation, access to healthy food, to clean air. Those kinds of subsidies don't have to come only from the federal government, although they have to come primarily from the federal government. But while we're building that civil rights movement, there's a lot that the private sector can do to remedy its own failures in this area. We also have current policies that reinforce segregation that need to be changed. The biggest subsidy program the federal government now has for low-income families who are disproportionately minority is the low-income housing tax credit. The Federal Treasury Department regulations that govern how these subsidies are given to developers of low-income housing place a premium on placing low-income housing in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. That's crazy. That should be reversed. We should certainly improve the housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods, but we should also be creating opportunities for those African American and other low-income families who want to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods to do so. The Section 8 voucher program, with which many of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with, that subsidizes low-income African American families and disproportionately again, and Hispanic families to move to apartments that otherwise wouldn't have been affordable to them. That program reinforces segregation because the way in which those subsidies are defined and constructed make it impossible to rent apartments for the most part in higher opportunity communities and directs African Americans predominantly to low-income segregated neighborhoods. That program should be redesigned.
Our time is almost gone, but I have to say your book was completely compelling and also, frankly, very depressing. When I read in the footnotes about how an old practice of racially identifying housing projects by naming what were supposed to be colorblind institutions, the segregated Black projects were named after Black historical figures, white projects after whites, now has a modern day corollary in cities that rename boulevards after Martin Luther King Jr. They tend to be boulevards in Black communities, not in white neighborhoods. Are you optimistic or pessimistic as you look for signs of real change?
Well, I'm very optimistic, not confident, but optimistic. We are having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever have before in American history. Whether that discussion will lead to a new civil rights movement that makes it uncomfortable to maintain these segregated patterns is an open question. But without that awareness, that discussion that we're having on a national basis of how government in particular created the segregation on an explicitly racial basis that we know today, without that discussion, we can't move forward. So we're having that discussion, we're having that awareness today. The next step is to move forward with concrete policy advocacy and actions at the local level to redress segregation.
Well, as our Governor Charlie Baker noted recently in remarks after the George Floyd atrocity, the color of law is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand where we've been and where we need to go. Mr. Rothstein, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.